Hello, everyone. Hopefully that's the last time I use the mic tonight. My name is Jeff Manternak from Red Rock Biofuels. And the first thing I want to do is thank you all for being here. I'm here with two of my colleagues, Mary Din, also from Red Rock Biofuels, and Cheryl Davis from Mergent, who we have partnered with as part of our environmental health and safety program. So again, thank you all for being here. And if I'd like to start the meeting with a Pledge of Allegiance. We have a flag here up front. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all very much, and I'm very pleased to see a great turnout this evening. We wanted to come to town to engage in a discussion with the community. We've had a chance to meet some of you over the past several years, and hopefully we'll get a chance to meet more of you this evening. We're trying to do a few things here tonight, one of which is to introduce the project to those folks that we haven't gotten a chance to speak to yet, engage the community in a discussion, and lay out our plan and the facts. We also will describe some more formal participation opportunities for those folks that are interested. As you might imagine, there's a number of regulatory agencies looking over our shoulders that provide opportunity for public comment, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And then also an important part of this evening is to provide a question and answer period. And we're going to do that in the spirit of openness, so please feel free to engage and ask questions on any topic that you would like. We do have a fairly full room tonight. I'm very happy to see that. That means, though, that out of respect for everyone in the room, what we'll try to do is move through those questions kind of succinctly. I'll respond to it, and then if we've got more time toward the end of the evening, we'll have an opportunity to come back for maybe a little more detail on a particular topic. So what we'll do is, let me just sort of lay out the program. The first thing I'll do is run through some slides. I recognize that it's a little far away. I'll do my best to do some pointing and try to describe as much of what's on the slide as I can, because I know it's kind of hard to see. Then we'll kind of run through some frequently asked questions that we get about the project. And in that part of the program, I'll be looking to Cheryl in particular to run through some of that. And then finally, we'll get into the question and answer period. There was a sign-up sheet for people that had questions out front. As I understand it, that got a little buried in the process, so we'll try to pull that out. Don't fear, though, if you didn't get a chance to sign up for a question, I'll just take them from the floor here. And then what I'd like to do is kind of release everyone at 8 o'clock. I can answer questions about, the project that I have lived, eaten, slept, and breathed for the last 4 years of my life, all the way till 3 in the morning. So we'll take it off-site for that. But if you don't get your question in before the formal program ends at 8, we will absolutely be available after that to answer questions. And then finally, if you need to get going, we understand that. Please feel free on the tables. There are papers for written comments or questions. We will round all of that up. If you'll leave your contact information on that, we'll be sure to get in touch with you regarding your questions. So the idea here is to try to make ourselves available. My Name, email address, and phone number are right there. I do live in Oregon, up in the Portland area. I come down here pretty regularly. I'm always happy to hear from folks that have a comment, a concern, a question, or something else about our project. All right, next thing. So we've kind of been through the purpose of the meeting, and I do just want to try to run through a couple of ground rules that I'd like to adhere to out of respect for everybody in the room. And that is that we're here in a spirit of mutual respect, courtesy, and patience. I am happy to engage in constructive dialogue with anyone on our project, and I hope that it's constructive. I hope that we can maintain an atmosphere here in the room where everybody feels welcome. I would ask, and I'll do my very best, not to interrupt other speakers when they're talking. I would ask that you please silence your cell phones if that's possible. If you can try to sort of limit any sidebar discussions just down to a whisper so that folks can hear what's happening. Please do participate. That's the idea. When we get to that Q&A session, I do hope that there's lots of hands, lots of good questions. And then, regarding time, when I do field questions, I'll try to move through them. And out of respect for everyone else, I'll try to do that quickly. If we see that that's going to become an issue, I'll probably ask one of my colleagues to do some timing, and that way we make sure everybody has a chance. Okay. With that, what I'd like to do is get into this project overview, and that will take us probably 30 minutes or so. And I realize that it's getting a little bit warm in here, so you're excused. I won't turn down the lights because then I get everybody to sleep. But that's just what happens in big full meetings. There's a picture of a bunch of our mugs up here. All of us have between 13 and 22 years of experience in the senior management team in renewable fuels. We're planning on building a renewable fuels facility here, and we are a veteran team of developers, engineers, constructors, and operators. We have, as a team, we've all worked together for more than 10 years, and we have financed, built, and operated about 10. It says 4 on here. That's sort of the full chain. 4 in the last decade and 10 or 12 over our careers, totaling about $650 million of concrete and steel that we have managed and put into the ground. A big portion of the Red Rock story and a big reason at why we are locating our plant not just in Lakeview, not just in Oregon, but in the whole western United States. Everybody here is familiar with it, but there's been a tremendous buildup of biomass on the western forest, particularly on federal grounds, over the past number of decades. I don't have to tell you that when suppression has been one of the dominant tools used for forest management out west, that leads to biomass accumulation. One of the first things you hear on a news report now is how big the fire is and what % contained it is. We all know that fire is a natural part of the landscape. Many of the tree species and other species require fire to seed their next generation. Fire is natural, but now we have all moved into the forest. That's where we are. And so when we use suppression, biomass builds up and we get catastrophic wildfires. And that's happening all the way from Montana to Oregon, down to California, all the way over to Arizona, New Mexico. All 11 western states face similar issues. They have different ecosystems, different forests, but they face very similar issues. That's part of what led Red Rock to look at a plant location in the western United States. Wildfires, they burn much hotter, and some of you have personally experienced this, I know, in this area, but they burn much hotter than they should because of the fuel accumulation on the land. Because of that same fuel accumulation, prescribed burns, managed burns become that much more difficult to manage as a tool. And some of you are familiar with the bark beetle epidemic that has ravaged western forests here in the United States and in Canada. That just makes the whole problem worse. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about how our project fits into that greater story on the western landscape. This is a picture taken by a Lakeview resident here of the Berry Point fire just a couple years ago. That's not natural. That is not what a western forest landscape is supposed to look like after a fire. Right? That's from a lot of fuel accumulation. The issue has gotten to the point, I think, where there's a whole range of groups that have gotten behind woody biomass utilization as a management tool, as a means to take some of the biomass off of the land. This is from the U.S. Forest Service, right? The largest land manager in the West. U.S. Forest Service has, as a total national agency, thought heavily about using woody biomass utilization as one of the management tools to help them manage their forests. And the Forest Service is not alone, but they are somewhat uniquely challenged. They're an enormous agency in terms of the acreage that they cover, right? And here's a look at their budget. This is from a few years back, but this is for fiscal year 2010. It's not that much different today. That's a $5 billion budget. And they spend half of it on fire prevention and suppression activities. That means that they don't have that half of their budget to do all the other things that Forest Service is tasked with doing on the federal lands. And this is in a below average year for 2010. So the next one that you'll see, and forgive me for the folks that can't quite see it, I'll try to point out what's happening here. Over the last 25, 30 years, you've seen both the number of acres, which is here in red, and at this low level, you're looking at about 2 million acres a year of acreage that's burned. That's back in the 1985 era. And now, up in 2010, 2011, you're looking at almost 10 million acres a year of forest fires that our Forest Service is trying to manage. And of course, as that acreage and as that intensity goes up, so too does the cost. You can see the cost of fighting it, and this is in constant dollars. The cost of fighting that, has grown from, $250 million to $500 million, all the way up to $2.5 billion a year. It's eating up more and more of our Forest Service budget. I like some of the work that the Oregon Forest Resources Institute puts out. For those of you who can see, you've got kind of a choked forest here on the left, and a more natural looking forest here on the right. And the other thing that this slide, what I like about it is it shows that the cost of thinning an acre is about $500 an acre. The cost of fighting a fire on that same acre is about $5,000 an acre. So it's about 1/10 the cost to treat an acre versus fight a fire on it. Major environmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, they're another large land manager out west. They have come around to woody biomass utilization as an effective means of helping to manage the forest and take some of the biomass off before it burns. And they experienced an enormous fire down in Arizona, 500,000 acres. I don't have to tell you all that, Fremont, Wainema, some of the BLM lands around here, a lot of the private ground around here is in a fire-prone zone. If you look at it, Oregon classifies according to, I think, 1, 2, and 3. All around Lakeview here is class 3. High risk of uncharacteristically severe forest fires. You all live here. I don't have to tell you this. It's the same on the other side of the border, 7 miles away. So, I'm just going to back out. We did kind of a deep dive there into the forest, and that's part of what led Red Rock to be here in the West. We've worked in renewable fuels for decades. And some of the renewable fuels, like corn ethanol, for example, they take some heat for using available cropland. On the contrary, we think, pulling some of that excess waste biomass off of the forest, off the choked forest, can actually do some good for a lot of communities out west. So I think there's some real benefits to a project like ours. The first is that versus conventional fuels, the fuels that we produce will be lower in greenhouse gas emissions. We will reduce that fuel load. Our plant will pull in, give or take, 250,000 green tons or about 140,000 dry tons a year of residues off the forests. Just by virtue of removing that, and if you look at the acres that we treat every year, let's say it's 10,000 acres. If you take that and multiply that, actually it's more than 10,000 acres, sorry, I think it's about 14,000 acres. If you take that and multiply it by your $4,500 per acre difference, we can make a dramatic impact on the cost of firefighting in this area by reducing the risk of those catastrophic wildfires. And the other thing that happens, when you do have one of those catastrophic fires, you all have seen it and experienced it. You have uncontrolled emissions going up into the air. You have degraded soils, and so frequently you get slides, like happened in Colorado. You get severe impact on water quality as well. And maybe worst of all, you've lost all of that energy, literally, up into the air. It's gone up in smoke. I'm going to just spend a minute here talking about our process, the process that we will use to convert that 140,000 dry tons a year into about 15 million gallons per year of renewable fuels. So, first thing to do is to say we have the world of renewable energy is kind of two different camps. On the one hand, you have renewable power production, and that's solar and wind, and some people put hydroelectric in there, and fuel cells, and lots of other things that make power. And then you have the camp of renewable fuels, and that's where we are. We make renewable fuels. We are using a process that has been around for about 80 years or so. And I'm just going to step through that. I know this is very small, so I have blow-ups on the next couple of slides. We start with gasification. This is it's kind of for those that can see it, it's kind of a sketch of a gasification plant that was built in Baltimore about 200 years ago. This was the old town gas that they used to light lamps and things like that. But gasification is very different than combustion. Okay, in gasification, You put fuel, like wood chips or coal, into a contained vessel, like that, and heat around the outside of that vessel. And that's what we're doing. Combustion is what happens in your fireplace. When you light a piece of wood on fire, that is combustion. That's not what we're doing. We start with gasification. That started 200 years ago. We next run through a process called Fischer-Tropsch. That's named after the two German inventors who developed that process about 80 years ago. And that's where you run the product of gasification. If we go back to my example here, in my can, if I put my biomass in and I heat around the outside of that, I get hydrogen and carbon. I don't have combustion, okay? I get hydrogen and carbon in there. And then in the Fischer-Tropsch, I put that through a reactor. I run that over a catalyst, an iron or a cobalt catalyst, and that produces hydrocarbons. When you think about what nature has done to give us oil, you take biomass and dead dinosaurs and all sorts of other stuff, put it in the ground for 200 million years under some pressure, let it decompose, and you get long-chain hydrocarbons. We're kind of doing the same thing, except accelerate it to about 2 hours instead of 200 million years. We break all of the carbon and the hydrogen in the wood down, and then we recombine it at the molecular level into long-chain hydrocarbons. That's what happens in our Fischer-Tropsch process. And you're quite literally just taking a carbon and linking a hydrogen on either side and building it up into long-chain hydrocarbons. Our crude product that we don't sell, it's just an intermediate product. It happens in the plant. It's clearish or whitish because it doesn't contain all of the impurities like sulfur and other things that oil that has been in the ground for 200 million years has in it. We produce a very clear synthetic crude. We take that synthetic crude through the last portion of our process, which is upgrading. That looks like distillation. That's where you're cutting that crude into its different constituent components using hydrogen. So those are the three components of our process. They've all been around for about 80 years. We have a little bit of a different twist that I'll tell you about later. Commercial scale Fischer-Tropsch based refineries exist around the world today. This is a picture of a plant that's over in the Middle East. Instead of using biomass that they don't have a lot of there, they use natural gas on the front end of their process. Natural gas is CH4, so they get their carbon and their hydrogen from natural gas instead. Now, you can't see it particularly well, but it kind of looks like an enormous city. This is a 200,000+ barrel per day refinery. It's enormous. There's a tiny little person right down here. It's enormous. We are nowhere near that scale. We are 1/200th of that size. And we use smaller scale reactors that I'll show you in just a minute that would take that 1/200th down even further. But that's what a full-scale commercial Fischer-Tropsch refinery looks like. We are building much smaller. We're building in the biomass scale. So I mentioned that we do things just a little bit differently. In the Middle East, they run their plants on natural gas. In South Africa, they have Fischer-Tropsch refineries that run off of coal next to large coal mines. Those are also, 100,000+ barrel per day refineries. We're 1/100th of that size. And this is part of why we can do it. We use these very small scale reactors that have these plate and frame exchangers inside them. It looks a lot like the radiator in your car. And that way we get a lot more surface area packed into a much smaller volume. Our small reactors are about the size of a VW bus, but they weigh about 25 tons apiece, as opposed to the, say, 2 tons that a VW bus weighs. And that's how we can get them so small compared to a large commercial scale. And we are necessarily limited in the scale of our refinery just by the draw radius. In that respect, we're somewhat similar to, say, a biomass power plant that uses combustion. That's not what we do, but we have a very similar draw radius for our woody biomass residues. So this is just the last slide here on our conversion process, where we go from woody biomass residues through gasification and Fischer-Tropsch and finally through upgrading, and we make 15 million gallons per year of renewable fuel. Now, electricity is electricity, right? Now, some of it might be base load, some of it might be intermittent, like wind or solar, but at the end of the day, electricity is electricity. Over here with renewable fuels, there's a lot of different renewable fuels. When you think about it, there's lots of conventional fuels that you all use in your daily life or businesses run on. Everything from propane to butane to gasoline to diesel to jet fuel and lots more. So the spectrum of renewable fuels is almost as wide as the spectrum of conventional fuels. In our case, instead of making ethanol or biodiesel that many of you have heard about, we make something, because of our conversion process, that's a much higher energy content per gallon, and we're starting from really a synthetic crude. It's the same stuff that they make Mobil 1 out of. If you see Mobil 1 advertised as a super high-grade engine lubricant oil, that's a synthetic oil. We start with a synthetic crude oil to make our products. So we make jet and diesel and a fuel called naphtha. And all of that fuel gets made in our refinery. And some of the diesel we're going to try to distribute locally. The balance of that fuel, including the jet fuel, will move down to Southern California. Northern California over the rail, the Bay Area. Next, I'm going to just talk a little bit about our site, and coming up after that, we have some of the some more process type stuff and the FAQ coming up. But we've selected a site here just south of Cadmus Road, and it's bordered by Highway 395 and the railroad. We do plan to use the railroad, the Lake Railway, to ship our product, minus whatever diesel we're able to distribute locally. We plan on shipping that down to the Bay Area of California via rail car. That'll be about 500 rail cars of fuel a year if you do the math on 15 million gallons. Now, you can't quite see it here, but along the rail, we also plan on building out a natural gas pipeline lateral. Many of you may remember that a number of years ago, El Paso, now Kinder Morgan, brought the Ruby pipeline through town, and it runs down there by Crane Creek and the railroad. So we'll run that up to our plant, and we'll be using that natural gas for heating our process. Okay? We combust the natural gas for heat. In upset conditions, we can actually put that natural gas through process.
What does that mean, natural gas? Will you be using that to create more fuels?
I will, yeah. If I can just address that. Yep, I'll talk about that in the Q&A.
Sure.
One important component of our project is the number of jobs. Obviously, when we come to town, we're going to need qualified folks to run our facility. In our case, that's about 25 direct employees on site. And through the help of Business Oregon, we've done some estimating for the number of other jobs that creates. Some of the indirects, of course, come from the harvesting, collection, and transportation of that woody biomass residue to our facility. And then there are other indirect and induced jobs. I'm happy to cover that maybe offline if you have questions about what those might be or how they were calculated. For a total number of jobs here, I'm sorry, that's construction, forgive me. I was talking about the permanent jobs. I'll go back up to construction in a moment. Here's our 25. We expect about 75 indirects. That's mostly biomass collection and harvesting. There's some induced jobs, that's some of the ancillary support services that we'll be using, for total employment of about 120. Now, I'm expecting these are largely full-time employees here at the plant. Some of the indirects might be seasonal. You can't have people in the woods every year all the time, so there might be some seasonality component to that. Let me flip back up to construction here for just a moment. We've got a good-sized project. There's a few different numbers floating around out there. 200 million is a good round number. That's give or take what we're looking at for construction of this facility. That takes a lot of well-qualified people. We expect it will take about 18 months. Now, when we say go, that doesn't mean we start with a shovel in the ground. Usually it means we start writing very big checks for deposits and other things. So you won't see people on the ground building with shovels and other things for all 18 of those months. And there's some winter months around here in particular where it can get difficult. So you can probably look at about 12 months where there's folks actually on site. Of course, with construction, direct jobs, you also have indirect and induced as well. Some of the project benefits. I spent a long time up front talking about the impact on forest health and woody biomass utilization by reducing the load on the forest. And I spent that time because it matters to folks in this community. You live here, and you're surrounded by these forests. We will be producing renewable fuels. We'll be the only refinery in the state of Oregon to make diesel and jet fuel. There is one other renewable fuels plant that is operating that we actually built up in Borden, Oregon, up at the opposite end of the state. That's the only other operational fuel refinery in the state. In Oregon, we make renewable fuels. And they have a lower carbon footprint than the conventional fuels that they displace. Of course, there's job creation. We talked about the number of jobs. I do expect that, with our particular job mix, that we'll be paying above the average salary. Naturally, there's local economic development that comes along with that plant, and we'll be extending that gas pipeline all the way up to our site. That takes that gas pipeline, about 2.7 miles closer to town. And of course, our hope is that we see another utility or another user pick that pipeline up and distribute that through town to give folks another option for area heating, for their homes, for the businesses, and what have you. I mentioned right up front that there will be additional meetings beyond just engaging Red Rock. If you'd like to talk to some of the agencies that are involved in this project, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is the state agency that regulates our air permit. And they have announced that they are coming to town for a meeting here in just about 10 days. They're here on March the 12th. If you'd like further information on that meeting, please feel free to see one of us afterwards. And then I believe they're doing a public hearing. That date has not been set by the DEQ. Also, our project does enjoy some federal funding, and because of that, we have a hearing coming up related to our environmental assessment for what we call our NEPA permit. There's an opportunity to engage there as well. That meeting will be published. That date is not set yet, but that's coming up within the next probably couple of months. I've got a few more slides here to try to work through, and then we'll get into some Q&A. But what I'd like to try to do is just run through some of the questions that we hear pretty frequently from folks. And I've talked about one of them already, biomass power versus renewable fuels. Naturally, a lot of folks have questions about fuel, so I'll address that. Fuel transport and rail safety, we can talk about that one. And also air quality. So let me just run through those. This is a schematic, and there's one of these in the back there. So we have some of these slides blown up and put up on posters. So if it went too fast up here or you couldn't see it, some of these are scattered around the room. This is a biomass power plant for making renewable electricity. This is not what we do, but I use it to just contrast. So in biomass power, you have wood coming in here, air coming in, and you have combustion. You have a flame, and you have everything that comes, all of the emissions that result from combusting wood. It's a much fancier form of what's happening in your wood-burning stove or wood-burning fireplace. But that's essentially the process, okay? And then you're capturing the heat off of that to run a boiler, spin a turbine, and off goes the power. And again, that's not what we do. This is what we do. In this first step, part of gasification is pyrolysis. That's kind of the hot end of the gasification process. And in pyrolysis, again, that's where we're going to take wood chips, put them into a kind of a vessel like that, and heat all around the outside by combusting natural gas. The woody biomass itself never sees a flame, never gets combusted. In fact, gasification, it happens in the absence of oxygen. From there, from the moment that we introduce the biomass into our gasifier, none of that leaves process all the way until it's burned in a jet engine or a diesel engine. The entire process is completely contained and enclosed. Our only emissions are from the combustion of natural gas. So we heat externally. We do not combust any natural gas. We do not combust any woody biomass. Then it runs through the Fischer-Tropsch, and you can see here, little schematics of long chain hydrocarbons. And then we just cut these hydrocarbons, and that forms our different cuts of diesel, jet, and naphtha. Naphtha is a little unfamiliar. It is a refinery intermediate. So they'll use it in process to make other fuels in a refinery. It's also used as chemical industry feedstock. They'll take naphtha and they'll break it down to make other things. And finally, you can see it in lighters. There's some consumer products that use naphtha. Sometimes those sterno cans that you see can be naphtha. It's a lighter kind of a fuel product. In fact, it's the light ends. It's what's left over for us. So again, we are not combusting biomass. And there's no emissions from the start of our process all the way through the end that relate to the wood. The only emissions related to wood that we have to do with biomass handling and receiving, and all of that, we have emissions control points for that. This slide, and you can't see it, so I'm just going to talk about it. But if you have more questions about this, come and see me. This is about how odor works in a petroleum refinery. If any of you have ever driven through Long Beach or past Richmond or up into some of the refineries up in Puget Sound, you can smell a refinery. What you smell is sulfur. We don't have sulfur. Sulfur is a poison to our Fischer-Tropsch cavities. We do everything possible to make sure that there is no sulfur coming through our process. Sulfur is in the crudes. You might have heard of, sweet crudes versus sour crudes. Sours, that's from sulfur that's in the crude. They have to remove almost all of that sulfur in the refining process. That's what you're smelling at an oil refinery. You're not going to smell that from our refinery. You might be thinking, well, pulp and paper mills, they stink too. And they do. Again, that's sulfur that they use in their process. We don't take sulfur into our process. We don't make sulfur. And we have sulfur guard beds in place to make absolutely certain that none of that sulfur gets through into our process. So again, if you have more questions, I know you can't see it, but I put it up here and we can run through it later if you have questions on that. That's another one on the paper making process where they use sulfur and other acids in process. So our only source of odor is going to be from the wood chip piles. And that wood chip pile is inside a building. And it's got emissions control on it. There's no sulfur in the wood, and there's no odor. There's no odors from the process itself. I've said a few times, from the moment that we introduce those wood chips into process, it is fully contained all the way until it's burned at its end destination in a diesel engine or a jet engine. There's no release anywhere in our plant. And we don't use any odorous chemicals. Fuel transport, we do plan on moving almost all of our product, with the exception of whatever diesel that we can distribute locally. We plan on moving it down the Lake Railway, up through Alturas and onto the Union Pacific line. We're fortunate tonight to have Paul DeDalius from the Lake County Railway here. At this time, I'm not going to tap in, but if there are questions or specific comments, I might look back to Paul to address, and he's in the back of the room with his hand up there. Thank you, Paul. I might look to Paul to provide some specifics. Paul runs this railroad, and he'll be the one, if folks have questions about how the rail is working and what have you. So I'll leave those to Paul. Finally, let me just talk about air emissions. That's sometimes a question. Well, let me just first start the overview by saying, I said up front, we have a number of regulatory agencies, a literal alphabet soup, looking over our shoulder, right? We follow all local, state, and federal laws regarding everything that we do, and that includes air emissions. So what I've listed up here is, in this column, are emissions that have gone through into the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for our facility versus what the ODEQ lists as their significant emissions rate. And in every case, we are below. Now, for those of you that have seen some of this before, you might be familiar with some of the higher level permitting, like Title V permits. We are not a Title V permit. We fall below all of those thresholds. So this is state law, and we are below state law in every category. And with that, I want to first say thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you being here, listening, and I'm going to start with the one question that I heard back here related to natural gas and the use of natural gas. All right, let me just take one quick sip. It's a little warm. All right. Natural gas. So we plan to start our facility on natural gas and use natural gas in process when we have upsets. That doesn't make renewable fuel, but it does keep our plant up and running if it snows in July, as it has done at some point, right? If we have a breakdown of some sort, one of our truck tippers, both of our truck tippers go down, and we have to get them fixed, and we run out of fuel in our biomass pile, we can keep the plant running on natural gas. That's not what we plan on doing, but it's there as a backup. So our facility will be permitted to use natural gas when necessary. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and the other part is, I see some Forest Service people here from our local. What is their plan of the amount of biomass do we have? I mean, I used to work for the Forest Service years ago, did reforestation, and there's steel reforestation that's not growing. And for us to go and thin and do all this and not plant the trees or clean up what needs to be cleaned up. I mean, I have a concern what Forest Service has. What do we have on the Fremont Wainema that you're going to do this forever? You know, or, I mean, what is this really, truly, the sustainability of this?
And I can address that.
Right, because I haven't seen anything from our Forest Service and what they have, and I feel that's a crucial partner in this.
Sure.
Yes.
And it absolutely is. And of course, that's something that we've looked at very closely. If we're going to sink $200 million of concrete and steel in the ground, we want to make darn sure that there's sufficient forest in an economic draw radius that we can have a sustainable supply. And we've had work done by very knowledgeable, credible folks, as have a few of the other other project variants, let's say. I know Iberdrola came to town a while ago,
Right.
But within a 75-mile radius, we think on an annual basis, there is 1.5 to 2.5 times the biomass that we need, and that's from private, that's a mix of private and federal ground, and we plan to pull from both. Federally, I think most of it would be from the stewardship unit. And when you think about it, a lot of that is coming off already. We're not going to take really any more than is already being harvested or otherwise touched for timber production.
No, those are the numbers I would like to see. I'd like to see the plan of all the people coming together, because when you say that you've looked into it, industry's looked into it. This is our land. This is taxpayers' land that I enjoy going out in the forest, and I enjoy doing that. And like I said, I don't have a whole working with the Forest Service and doing and seeing industry. I know that some of that stuff, number-based and computerized, you can get a lot of numbers and a lot of things that look really good, but it really isn't.
Well, I guess all I can say is that, between the private land and the available federal land, and of course, I can't, just like you can't, I can't just go on there and start cutting trees. It all happens under Forest Service contract. And we don't even take the trunk, right? The trunks are all going somewhere else. So if the trunk is cut down, what we're taking, and I should have mentioned this earlier, we take the tops and the branches. That's what we take. And we'll take mill residues. If you give me just a moment, sir, I forgive me for skipping this point earlier, but when I say residues, what I mean is the stuff that no one else wants. That's what we put into our process. So if you think about it, if I'm a timber company or a sawmill, I'm after the trunk of the tree. And typically, what gets happened, my understanding of the dominant regime here is lop and scatter, and to a limited extent, pile and burn of the branches and the tops. It's those branches and tops, that excess, that we're simply chipping and bringing down the hill to our plant. So we're really not adding to any deforestation effort. All we're removing is the excess biomass. So if you'll if you've got more questions, I would love to hear, but let me just try to work through the room a little. Sir, did you have a question?
Yeah. Are you guys going to be purchasing switchgrass from local ranchers? Grow?
That's a good question. So some renewable fuels, in particular ethanols and the others that use what I would call a sugar pathway toward making their product, they use grasses. We do not use grasses. We use woody biomass.
Oh, okay. That's my question. Thank you.
Question, ma'am.
Speaking of residue, what happens to the biomass in the sealed up containers after the heating process? I mean, are they active?
That's a very good question.
And, you know, the problems with ashes, it's been the undoing of the biomass plant.
Yes. So the first thing that I will say is we run at a much hotter temperature because we're combusting natural gas. That allows us to run up at 1600 to 1700 degrees. What that means is that we convert a lot more of that carbon than a woody biomass power plant does. Now, we still have some ash left over. Basically, there's ash in the wood, and there's unconvertible material in the wood. And that comes out of our facility as ash as well. And we have a few plans for that. Number one is as a beneficial use in a ready-mix plant. A lot of times coal fly ash gets used in one of those cement mixes.
So there are limits, right?
There are limits, but we will truck that product out and we will fill up as many ready-mix plants as we can. Now, the secondary beneficial use is in roads. A lot of times it's mixed into aggregates. So that's another good use. That would also end up at a ready-mix plant, but it would be used for roadbed material. It's a very good binding agent. The third beneficial use doesn't really exist in this area because ash is generally acidic and your soils are acidic. And so normally we would use that as a soil amendment. If we can't do that here, we will truck it or rail it out of the area, say into the Willamette Valley, parts of California, and we will use that beneficially as a soil amendment. And the last option of all, if none of those we can find work, it will be transported out of the county for safe disposal. Hopefully that answers it. But I want to sell it. Trucks. No, it's trucks. And it's ash. It's not toxic. It's silica and unconverted carbon, right? It's material that's been heated to 1700 degrees and hasn't converted. There's nothing hazardous in it. Sir?
In your product, can you use burnt material from a forest fire?
It's a good question. Let me just repeat it. There's a question up from a gentleman in front about whether we can use burned material from a forest fire. The answer is yes. What we care the most about is BTUs. And when you think about it, we're making fuels that have a BTU content or an energy content that we measure in BTUs of about 120,000 BTUs per gallon. Our kind of raw wood coming into the plant, if it's fresh, it has a BTU content of anywhere from, say, 8,000 to 9,000 BTUs per dry pound of material. So if it's burnt, it doesn't really matter to me as long as it's not too far down the scale. It's going to take up space in a rather expensive piece of machinery. And so if it's not too badly degraded or decayed, the same thing kind of applies to decayed material out there in the woods. If it's not too far down on the BTU scale, we are happy to take it. Ma'am?
Yes, I was wondering, you're talking about the byproducts off the mill and whatnot for chips. What are you going to do with the juniper?
Well, that's a good question, and I understand that there's some differences of opinion relating to juniper, so I'm not going to wade right into the middle of that cat fight. But what I will say is that we are happy to take juniper. Juniper as a sawmill material is not particularly good versus other types of species. From our perspective, juniper is great. It actually has a higher BTU content than some of the other woods. And anybody that's burned it probably knows that. You throw a piece of juniper on the fire and it really goes. So we are happy to serve as an outlet for juniper. Again, without wading into the larger question about juniper and rangeland restoration, I'll just say that we provide a market. Sir, you had a question. Same question. Look at that. I got a twofer. Sir.
I was looking at your rail transportation.
Yes, sir.
It's probably safe to say there's not a lot of oil product going down that line at this time. But your products are probably fairly toxic. Should they spill into some riparian, who's responsible for cleaning that? Should your product end up in the river?
That is a good question, and I might tap my friend Mr. Dedalius to answer a question like that about the railroad. He's got a whole nother alphabet soup of agencies overlooking his operation. So, Paul, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that is correct. Whether it's a trucker, a motor carrier, barge, rail, those liquid fuels are in the custody of the carrier. So if there's a spill that was caused by the carrier or allowed by the carrier through whatever cause, then that's going to be the responsibility of the carrier and their associated insurance to take care of that situation.
So hopefully that answers the question about who's responsible. Now the other thing that I might just point out is that we use about 500 rail cars of fuel, and that's over the rail. That displaces what would otherwise be 200 trucks worth. Excuse me, 2,000 trucks worth, because every rail car holds about 4 trucks, and a truck can tip over just as well as a rail car, and the rail is actually moving much more slowly. Paul,
I wanted to add that our risk of a release is very, very low due to the construction standard that's been required of tank cars for a long time, coupled with our speed, which is 10 miles an hour. And so, our safety record is excellent in terms of we don't want to have derailments. They're very expensive and disruptive for us. And if we did have a derailment at 10 miles an hour, these tank cars aren't going to give us any problem, or we wouldn't be interested in hauling it.
So maybe the last thing that I'll add is that, by coming to town, we would help bring dollars to the railroad, and that would allow the railroad to continue to upgrade the rail and its service, and also provide better and more regular service to the other users of the rail. Ma'am. That's a good idea. I would love to lay a pipeline, and I'll just convey an analogy. John D. Rockefeller, I'm watching, maybe some of you are, that history special, The Men Who Made America. I would recommend it, it's excellent. But instead of using rail, Mr. Rockefeller decided he was going to lay pipe. And he laid about 4,000 miles of pipe in his day. I would love to pipe my product. There are no existing pipelines that run from this area to the Bay Area. And I can also share with you that laying pipeline is about $1 million a mile. It's a little on the expensive side. So we choose the wheeled pipeline instead. Ma'am, you had a question?
Yes, you said you were going to put some money into the railroad.
Well,
we have had so many things come off the railroad. I mean, they dumped a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Over by Alturas.
Right.
Lots of things.
Yeah, my company.
And the line is not good.
Well, the last 2 years we have.
My company's been involved with this rail line since 2009.
At 10 miles an hour,
Yeah.
you're going to get things there. And
Well, keep in mind that railroad is
the weight of the stuff.
the most efficient means of ground transportation, our contact area for every wheel, steel on steel, is less than a dime. And we're running on roller bearings. Each tank car moves about 3 to 4 truckloads that would otherwise be on the highway to get down to, you know, the Bay Area. So we're a very efficient means of transportation. Our
railroad.
well,
Yes, I'll disagree on that.
I've been here since 2009. I'm happy running it. It's a challenge. It's hard work, but you know, we enjoy handling it. And the reason 10 miles an hour works is because of the tonnage we move. So each rail car is 4 truckloads. Some of our trains leaving town are 20 rail cars. So that would be 80 truckloads out on the highway. So
They better do a lot of work to that railroad.
well, they is me.
Well, you better do a whole lot of work to that railroad.
That's what we've been doing.
If I can, I know that Lake Railway has been doing a significant amount of work to the rail, and what we might do is just to keep the discussion moving. I know there's other questions. Perhaps we can, the 3 of us talk afterwards. Man, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm concerned. We're on an earthquake.
Well, I am aware that we're in an earthquake zone, and so are our builders. And so, just like for houses, when you're building an industrial facility, you build according to the earthquake zone that you're in. And so everything is rated for this particular zone. But thank you. Okay, sir.
How much water are you going to be using for your process?
Very minimal. It's a great question. Actually, we use very little water in process because it actually comes in the wood itself. I talk about things in terms of dry tons because that's how we measure it. But the wood that comes in at anywhere from, say, 40 to 50% moisture, which is really perfect for us. We have a draw of about 30 or 40 GPM, gallons per minute, which sounds like a lot, but for a plant like this is almost nothing. In fact, it's 10 or 20 houses. It's very minimal amount of water because all of our water comes in the form of the woody biomass itself. Sir.
So this is going to cover a 50-mile radius around to get the wood biomass. Is that correct?
In certain directions, as you can imagine, it's not quite as the crow flies. It's where the truck drives. And so in some directions, the trucks might go a little less than 50 to 75. In some, they might go just a shade more. But we talk about, a radius as the crow flies of about 50 to 75 kind of tops. You get too much further out than that, and you start, paying too much for transportation, really, is what it amounts to.
So within that 50-mile area, there will be nothing there.
No, I don't think so. On an annual basis, there is 1.5 to 2.5 times our need. So if we take even our 1x out, our 1 times need out, there's still another half a plant to 1 plant's worth of material in excess.
Every year.
Every year, correct, and on an ongoing basis. Thank you. Gentleman in the back. Hey, sir.
Once you're under full production of operation, what is the total amount of flammable product going to be stored locally? What plans do you have in terms of community-wide emergency preparedness for a disastrous event?
So that's a great question. Let me just try to take those one at a time. The first is how much we store on site. Because we can rail our product to market pretty efficiently, we might store 15 days tops out of our total 360-day year. So at no more than at most 500,000 or 1 million gallons, which it sounds like a lot of fuel. It's nothing on the scale of what you see at large refineries. Regarding emergency preparedness, we had a preliminary meeting with some of the fire marshals today, and that's something that we do with all the renewable fuels plants that we build. We start engaging the fire marshals early And often, a lot of times we're building plants in rural areas, whether it's out here in the West or in the Midwest. Oftentimes we're looking at a few full-time members of a fire department, but oftentimes it's a volunteer force, and that's the case here. So what we do is bring all those folks to the plant, put on the training, and we make sure that that happens a couple of times a year, so that as you see some rotation in that volunteer force, we make sure that folks are out at our plant getting trained. That's all part of our environmental health and safety program. We're looked over by OSHA, by the fire marshal, and all of the other agencies that would review those plans. And we have, I don't know, give or take a $4 million fire protection system, a full fire loop. We try to be very careful, run our plants as safely as possible. Hopefully that answers your question. If you do have more specifics, I'm happy to maybe talk a little more after.
Containment is part of the structure of the tanks anyway.
Yes, so the question or comment up here about containment, yes, all of the tanks, you have secondary containment around all of the tankage. That's right. And I think we had a question. Oh, sir.
How soon will the plant be in operation?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, how soon will the plant be in operation? It takes us about 18 months to build the plant once we commence. We're planning on commencing this summer. One of the reasons that we're here today and we weren't here doing this, say, a year ago, is that generally speaking, we try to maintain a low profile. We try to make ourselves available to members of the community, but do so in a way that we're not generating false hope, that we're not making promises that we can't deliver on. And so I say that we're planning on starting construction in about 6 months. That would see us operational by just about the end of 2016. So again, we try to maintain a low profile, not to avoid discussion or discourse, but to make sure that we're laying the appropriate groundwork for our project and we're not over-promising. That's never our goal as developers. Ma'am?
Who's going to build your project?
It's going to be me out there with the hand. No. We use a number of contractors. We have some of those contractors bidding right now. On a large project like this, as you might imagine, we split it out between a general contractor, an equipment or a few different equipment providers, and then an engineer. And so the building of the project, actually for a project this size, there's relatively little in comparison to some of the other projects that we built. There's not as much actual construction on the ground. More of it comes in as equipment in this project. There's still a fair amount of construction. That will all come down from a general contractor. We're just in the final selection phases now. Sir?
Are you going to open up a local office, advance a local office?
Yes, we do, but the question was, are we going to open up an advanced local office? The answer is yes. We'll, once we commence construction, as soon as we do that, I mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean that there'll be people on the site with equipment. It means we're signing big checks, but from that point forward, we plan on having folks here, and that will be months ahead of whenever dirt work actually starts.
And you're not opening an office right?
Today, I'm not opening an office, but anybody is always welcome to call me, email me, and when I come down to schedule some time, I would love to sit and talk. I should have said at the start, I have lived and slept and breathed this project for almost 4 years of my life. It is my passion, it is what I do, and I will talk until I'm blue in the face in case you hadn't noticed. Sir?
You're going to live here?
Am I going to move here? I will not be. We will have a general manager on site. Yeah, I'll spend a lot of quality time. Sir?
How far would one of the buildings be from, say, the property line of Lakeview?
Okay, let me make sure that I understand that question. The question, I believe, was how far would our buildings be compared to the property line of Lakeview? So let me address what I think are two separate questions. One is setbacks. Just like everyone who has a house or a building or a plant around here, there are certain setbacks against property lines and roads. Naturally, we follow those. Those vary according to the town and the county and the type of building and height of structure and what have you. So we'll follow all of that. The next question might have been, town of Lakeview. Our property, and let me scroll up to it, sits right at the edge of town, just south of Cadmus. As you can see, we have some of our structures fairly close, but still within setbacks to Cadmus Road. So if you call that town, I guess we're fairly close, but still within our setbacks. Yes, there's the ready mix plant. Cadmus Road, 395. Does that answer your question?
Town boundary is actually about 12.
Yes, so
you're half, 3/4 mile away from
forgive me, this gets a little more complicated, but I think the urban growth boundary runs down to Cadmus, whereas some of the town property stops north of that. I didn't mean to confuse those two. Mr. Sims.
Yeah, Jeff, Lakeview Ready Mix plant is within the boundaries of the town of Lakeview, so we go right to Cadmus Road.
Right down to here.
Yes.
There's our answer.
Is that urban growth or town?
That's town and urban growth boundary at the same location.
Yeah, I think they're coincidental right there.
So Ray, has the town taken full control of the urban growth boundary?
No.
Not at all?
We jointly manage the urban growth boundary with Lake County.
Okay. And like the wood stove issue and that, the town is in charge of the urban growth boundary?
In that instance, we are, yes.
Yeah, I see that drives me crazy because if I'm in the urban growth and being, in the town, I should be able to vote for a town council or a mayor if I want to, if I'm going to be incorporated into the town.
That might be a separate issue.
Yes.
Yes, another question.
When is the EA for comments?
Because
you're really sure about this happening and we haven't even gone through
I
all the
that.
things, and
That's
when
right.
is
So
the EA coming?
The EA will come up in just a couple of months. We will announce it publicly. If you'd like to come and put your name down on the list, we'd be more than happy to let you know when it does come out for comment. Sir, in the back.
That EA is not going to be categorically excluded, is it?
No,
sounds like it right now.
So you plan on doing an EA in 6 months?
No. So forgive me. The EA has been underway for.
No, I understand, but you still need to go through public scoping and come out with a draft and have it out for review and consultation. And so that's a tight time frame. And what my comment really is to the Forest Service and the supply assessment.
Yes.
In that you're looking at an area that extends beyond 2 regions, 2 Forest Service regions, and you're not just looking at the Fremont-Wainema. You're also looking at the MODOC. Is that correct? And if that's the case, a private supply assessment isn't going to be enough, in my view. Instead, the forests themselves and the respective regions need to get together, particularly since Mr. Vilsack was part of the presser that announced this project for the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
So, maybe your consultant could ask those questions.
Let me just try to split the comments into 2. One of which is the specific timeline of EA, and I'll allow Cheryl to jump in on that. And the other is, federal forest. We could pull strictly from private land.
Right.
And that does not involve the Forest Service. However, I will say that one of the things that drew us to this area from the start was the stewardship agreement. The fact that the community has come together in a way to help manage 500,000 acres of federal land underneath a stewardship agreement in which you have industry and Forest Service and community involvement. So
but you're also going to go to the MODOC, and as I understand it, MODOC staff are somewhat concerned about your feedstock needs driving their processes, much like fire drives their processes now.
You don't have to. I mean,
well, that's why I'm
if they
interested.
say
That's
no
why I'm
access-
interested in a forest supply assessment done by the professionals, which are the agencies that you're running from. And so that is going to be an issue for you as part of this EA. And you've got a very a fast time frame for your project.
So, and let me allow, this is Cheryl Davis from Mergent. Cheryl and I are former colleagues at a predecessor company that both of us were at. Cheryl and I have worked together for better than a decade, and Cheryl has another decade of experience before that on both the private side and the regulatory side. She has worked in some of the most difficult air districts in the nation, and that is not an understatement. She has worked in the South Coast Air District and in the Central Valley of California. And for anybody that's ever been in either of those are some really challenged places. So we are really pleased to have Cheryl as an integral member of our team. And with that, Cheryl.
Thank you. So let me describe where we're at with the EA. For those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with all these acronyms, when we go and have government funding, such in this case the DoD, we're subject to what's called the National Environmental Policy Act. That basically says there's a review of the project for environmental, cultural, wetlands, all those categories. There are different levels that you can trigger under there: environmental assessment, categorical exclusion, or environmental impact statement, which was the larger. Our project is an EA. That means it will not have a public scoping. It does not need to at the EA level. The draft has been delivered to the Department of Defense. The next step will be for them to give us formal comments. There will be an opportunity for us to address those comments. Once the DoD and the project are happy with how that draft EA looks, it will be posted. Interested parties such as yourself can request, if you're obligated, anybody who wants to write down and say, I personally want to be notified, we will do that. The DoD will announce that for review. When you trigger an environmental impact statement, it says that your EA said that you had unmitigated impacts. We do not. All of our impacts are mitigated. Then you do trigger some more public meetings. Not to say we wouldn't have one at some point, but there is a distinction between the process of an EA and the process of an EIS. And I don't want to drag you into the weeds, it takes a long time. Separate those, but with the sign-in sheet and through other outreach, we're more than happy to personally let folks know when that announcement will be. And the DoD is not under obligation, unlike certain agencies like the Air District, I call it Air District, but it's DEQ, they are under obligation to respond to us in certain amounts of time along the way. DoD is not. So we're not sure exactly when we'll see those comments back, which is why we're not prepared to say that it'll be released for comment. They understand when we want to build our project, though.
So you didn't have any mitigating
yes
on this piece of property? It's a 100-year plain. It's in.
We have mitigated impacts. In other words, we can mitigate any impact that we have. Unmitigated would be, for example, you see these big pipelines out there, and they're going to go through a place, and they can't repair the damage. That's just simply a fact of the project. They take the big one, Keystone, if it goes. They're going to be unmitigated impacts of that. It's going to go through some tough areas, and the damage will be permanent. There is a process in the NEPA for permanent impacts, permanent unmitigated. The project need, you must have a power plant, they can do that. Our project are mitigated. Okay. Anything that we found can be addressed, compensated for.
And so the wood part of it is what you put in as your EA to the DOD, right?
You mean
or do you have it with gas as well?
No, it's wood.
Okay, and you say you're going to use that now. That I see that as an issue because we've seen the emissions of wood that it's going to meet the Oregon state, but then you haven't shown the gas, what the gas is going to do. When you use gas, then you don't have a supply.
That's in our permit as well.
Yep.
So if I can, let me just try to wrap this particular question up with a clarification. Cheryl mentioned a few times, and thank you, Cheryl, DOD. Let me just clarify, Red Rock Biofuels has received generous support from 3 agencies underneath the Defense Production Act. And those agencies are the Department of Navy, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Energy, all combining together underneath a Defense Production Act grant or technical investment agreement. And finally, it is the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base that is the contracting office. And so some of you have had an opportunity to meet with those folks. They were out just a few months ago. Others of you might have an opportunity to meet with them in the future. But when we say DOD, that's a sort of a colloquialism for us to mean both the project sponsors, but also our project managers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So if there are additional questions along the EA, just to try to be fair to everybody that's got questions, please come and see us after. We're happy to talk about it. Sir.
Yeah, Jeff, maybe you can clarify this. At one point you said that natural gas is only used as a backup, but then I take it that you said at one time that natural gas was used for the gasification or the distillation of the wood chips. And also, if you are going to use the gas, is there going to be a filtration and a repressurization substation in the line somewhere after it leaves the main line?
That's a good question. So let me just try to make sure that we're clear about how Red Rock uses natural gas. Number one, we use it for process heat all the time. It does not come into contact with what is in process. So when we're running woody biomass, there is metal separating the two. Woody biomass and natural gas never come into contact. We combust the natural gas for process heat. In some ways, not unlike a gas furnace would. Now, during upset conditions, if it snows in July or there's some other problem, we can run natural gas in process a little bit like the plant that I showed up here. This plant, it's enormous. That's because it's a huge scale. That plant uses natural gas in a Fischer-Tropsch refinery. You need a source of carbon and hydrogen. And you can get that from natural gas, coal, biomass, tires, trash, you name it. Most stuff that you can see and touch has carbon and hydrogen in it. We plan on using woody biomass and making renewable fuels from it. So I think the second part was, how are you compressing, or at what type of pressure are you taking gas? We will run a 6-inch higher pressure line. We do not run at the full pressure of the Ruby. It will be stepped down, run to us, where it will be stepped down even further for our own use and for potential use further up the line in town. We will take it pre-odorization. For anyone that's had nat gas in a home outside of Lakeview, for example, the only reason you can smell it at all is because they add sulfur to it so that you can smell it and you know you have a gas leak in your house. We will take our gas pre-sulfurization. What's in the Ruby pipeline has no sulfur in it. And that's how we like it. So we'll take it like that. If it goes on into the community, there'll be a sulfur station added there to it. Does that answer your question?
So you're not aware whether Ruby Ridge line has to have that a device put in it to filter the natural gas coming from the Y to your plant?
I don't believe that there's a filter in place. There is already a valve down there at Crane Creek Road. You can see it. It's kind of it's a knockout valve or drop down valve, a regulator valve there. That's where we will connect and run the lateral up to our facility. So it'll drop down in pressure once from the Ruby, and it'll drop down a second time at our plant.
Okay, so there will be one at the river. Thank you.
Let me just check. Ma'am, please.
Yes. So you're going to take so many megabytes off the Ruby, is that correct? And you've already looked into that?
We will take a given number, yes. We measure gas either in decatherms or million BTUs. And yes, there is available nat gas on the Ruby.
So is the town of Lakeview going to be able to buy that natural gas at your price, or are you going to charge them more to use your pipeline?
Well, that's an awfully good question, too. And what I can say is that we buy, gas is kind of a funny thing. You can buy gas straight from a producer. What comes through on the Ruby is made out in Colorado and Wyoming. That's where that gas comes from. And it gets delivered all the way over to Malin, the end point, where it connects into the north-south trunk lines. You can buy gas from anyone that owns gas on the Ruby. Separately, you get to pay for transportation. So we will enter into an agreement with Kinder Morgan, which is now the owner of the Ruby, for transportation of gas. So we will pay Kinder Morgan for transportation. We will buy the commodity itself from other producers that own it. Now, regulation of residential commercial use of natural gas falls to a public utility. And Vista has expressed some interest in this area, and there may be others that might.
City of Lakeview?
City of Lakeview certainly could do it. From our point of view, we help drag the pipe up from Ruby. We make sure that about a third of that capacity on that pipe is protected for future use by folks other than Red Rock. That's a significant amount of use. So that pipe, that 6-inch pipe, will pull about 22 to 25,000 MMBTU per day. We will use anywhere from 6 to 10 or 12,000, depending on how we're running. So that leaves roughly 1/3 of the gas of the 22 to 25 for the town of Lakeview, which is currently, I'm just going to pull out a number and say probably 100 times more than 2 large commercial users that you have currently in town could use.
But
so there should be.
You hold that back case that if somebody in Reno that needs gas, then you can sell that product that you were going to pay for Lakeview over to Reno.
Yeah, so it's not something that we're going to sell. It gets a little complicated, but we're going to reserve capacity, 1/3 of the capacity on that pipe for the county, town, and other future users in the community, whoever those folks might be. Ideally, it would be a public utility that would come in and serve everybody. We don't want to be in the public utility business. Our business is hard enough. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir.
Of course, sir.
The same question could apply to diesel. You're going to go in big competition with stock.
Well, okay. So the good thing is, there's no diesel made in Oregon. When we manufacture diesel, we will be competing. If we distribute locally here, the only thing they'll be displacing is what's made up in Puget Sound or down in the Bay Area of California. It's made there and has to get brought in here. So we would be very pleased to work with the local suppliers of diesel fuels to see if they want to buy our product. We're not going to hang a sign outside of our plant and say diesel fuel for sale. No. Our idea is to work with folks. Again, that's not our business. We like to make the fuel, not sell it. So at the retail level, hopefully we'll get a chance to work with community partners that can help distribute that fuel. It has to be blended, and then it has to be put out. Ma'am, go ahead.
Yes, how long do you foresee the forest residue, forest fire products being available? Because at some point, we got these mess with our forests from them being overmanaged. Now,
Well, the last part of that sounds kind of like the thorny issue that I'm going to try not to prick my finger on it. So, yeah, you know, the forests have been here for thousands of years. I'm not going to claim that our plant will be here for thousands of years, but I certainly hope it's hundreds. You know, there hasn't been a new refinery, oil refinery, built in the U.S. since 1975, 40 years ago. The only new refineries in this country are renewable fuel refineries. And some of those have been around for 30 plus years. So I certainly hope that our renewable fuels plant is here for 30 or more years. And I would think, you know, given the fuel supply that's available in this area, the biomass supply, there's no reason we couldn't be here for hundreds of years. We don't plan on exhausting the forest. That's no good for us. Let me go to the back here. Mr. Walls.
Yeah, along that lines, before Red Rock, before Iberdrola, the Lakeview Stewardship Group did a strategy and had it here, and it was headed up by Mike Anderson from the Wilderness Society and Rick Brown from Defenders. We developed by forest type a strategy of what was sustainable to harvest off that forest and came to agreement on it. And it was peer reviewed by Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson. And that's what that's why we don't get all lawsuits here, is because that agreement's in place and you can't exceed that or we'll be in court. And so their demands is not what dictates what we did. We already set that up a long time ago. All 15, 20, it's been, you know, so we've got those agreements. And I don't see lawsuits because we're managing to that level.
Thank you, Jim.
And not more.
And forgive me, I may have neglected any questions that we have back in here. We have some very patient folks out that are out here. Any questions back here? Okay. Let's see. Man, you had a question, and then, sir, I'll come back to you.
it's my understanding that if you have a oil pipeline, you're responsible for any damage or exposure. But by using the railroad, you're transferring the financial responsibility to the railroad, which possibly.
So there was a question here about whether we transport our product by pipeline or railroad. If there is a problem on the railroad, we might somehow bankrupt Lake County. So let me just try to address that by the various means that, by which we could potentially transport our product. One is by pipe. I would love to do it. There's no existing pipe that runs down to the Bay Area or up to Portland or Seattle, and so we can't do that. The next two options are rail and road. Building a pipeline, frankly, is a bigger project than I have studying for. That it's 500 miles probably, and we just don't build pipelines. So relating to liability, the railroad carries insurance just like we carry insurance. And
could go bankrupt.
That's always a possibility, but all I can say is that, our product will be fully insured all the way down the rail, and the railway maintains sufficient insurance so that if it has a loss, it won't go bankrupt. That's fully insured, just like if it were on the road. If a tanker truck flipped over, the tanker truck would be carrying insurance as well. There's a question here about West Texas, and I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't know the answer to that one. No, that's okay. Mr. Dedalius, did you have a comment?
Well, I just wanted to speak, for a moment about maybe there's that concern about the solvency of the railroad. So Lake County owns railroad infrastructure. One time they managed and operated it in-house. That was some time ago, and I understand that they're quite happy with having a third-party railroad professional operate and maintain the railroad. We're not getting rich running the railroad here. It's a railroad, and railroads thrive on lots and lots of carloads. We would like more business. We're always working on more business. Long and short, I want to give you is that millions of dollars have gone into the maintenance and infrastructure improvement of the railroad in the 6 years that I've been here, and the vast majority of that has come out of freight revenues that that are charged to the users of the rail line. There's no local money that's gone into the railroad the 6 years that I've been here. To the contrary, we pay taxes, we pay rent, and we run our own show. We employ about half a dozen people here locally, and we're making a go of it. So I just wanted to speak on some of those things, and I also printed out about 30 fact sheets for interested community members. I didn't quite print out 100. Feel free to grab one of these from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that come up. I don't want to take over his agenda, so I'll let him run it. But
would you be available after the meeting?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I have some pictures of Alturas where the maintenance really looks good.
Like I said, we've put millions of dollars into the track. It's a big job.
Thank you very much. And we will be available afterwards. So there's a gentleman over here who's been patiently waiting, sir.
Okay, about 3 years ago, the new hospital in town got steam from this area where the building would be.
Yes, sir.
And the new structure would not be over a new steam pipes, would it?
No, as I understand it, those pipes, they run along the highway and then come down the county and town right away. We will not be building over any steam pipes.
Thank you.
Sir.
I'm going to read somewhere that Red Rock applied for an exemption to BACT on this construction site. That's available current technology?
I don't believe so, but let me just ask Cheryl.
This project isn't subject to best available control technology. The emissions levels are on that, so that slide's very helpful. That's the NSR. If you were exceeded those or had if I made sure they knew trigger, best available control technology, we're under those rates. We're gonna have to do that on it.
That said, we are spending considerable amounts of money. Let me just ballpark it at $1 million, maybe as much as $2 million on air emissions control equipment all the way through process. I'm going to just try to touch on, let me see if there's folks that haven't, let me get hands of folks that haven't asked a question yet, if I can. Sir.
You mentioned this was a federally funded project. Are you under the federal Davis-Bacon wages on this? Is it state prevailing wage? Or?
That's a good question, sir, and we are not. So some federal pools of money come along with Davis-Bacon requirements. This one does not. Let me see if there's others that haven't asked a question. Ma'am.
About how many trucks do you think will be hauling in the biomass?
That's a great question. So if you kind of break it down to an average plant day, we're expecting about 40 trucks per day.
Wow. And you have a route?
We're working with our biomass supplier on routes. There's a couple of different potential ways to do it. One would, of course, be the highway 395 to come down. We're also looking at some alternate means, so that has not quite yet been ironed out yet. Sir, in the orange.
Are these going to be? These are going to be employees of yours that are going into the woods?
No, sir.
You're getting private contract.
Correct.
Do you have any idea how much, like a yard of chips is going for it? What you're paying for it?
That's a matter between us and our private contractor, but we're using a supplier that's very well known in the area, well established, and they'll be working in turn with private contractors of their own and getting it out into the community. And at some point here, as the project gets moving and closer to commercial operations, they'll start talking about rates for the biomass. And man, you had a question?
I do. It sounds like this is such a large project and that there's going to be quite a bit of taxing on the local facilities, like the fire department and the Forest Service. And how do you intend to compensate? How does that even out? You've talked about all of the reasons why this is great for Red Rock Biofuels, but how is it benefiting Lakeview?
Sure, it's a great question. The couple of things I would say right off the bat, we'll be a pretty large employer in town. All those employees live here, spend money here, have homes here, and we will at some point be a pretty substantial property taxpayer. And we are currently working with the town and the county through all of that, but we will end up as one of the larger taxpayers on the rolls.
Do you do donations like to the local fire department? Of course. To the local
that's just part of being,
that you're taxing.
Absolutely. That's part of being a good community member, and that's part of what we do at all of our plants. As any community member would, that's part of what we view as our responsibility. Yeah. Suzanne.
Hi, Jeff. You mentioned there'd be about 25 permanent jobs at your plant. Can you give us any idea of the pay scale range? I understand there'd be laborers and there'd be managers. Can you give us, is it family wage, living incomes, or are you going to have $100,000 per year employees and $25,000 per year employees? Could you give us an idea of how that's?
I can. I think you can probably expect it to range anywhere from 30,000 or so. Almost everything would be permanent salaried positions. So anywhere from, call it 30, on up to, I would expect our general manager to be north of 100.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. I know there's a few more questions from folks that have asked questions. If you'll bear with me, I'm just trying to make sure everybody has a chance.
I don't live in Lakeview, but the truck concern me a little bit. You're adding more trucks per day to safety. Are you paying taxes into the city road department?
I believe, and Mr. Sims could correct me, or one of the commissioners, but I believe all of that flows through property taxes. That's how local roads get funded. Okay, on the diesel fuel that they burn. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I think you've had one, so we'll be sort of in the back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are enormous costs to this project that you are not considering as part of a cost of doing business. Emergency services were one of those things. Your $75 million that were given from taxpayer monies are part of that. The subsidies that are given to the railroad to operate is also corporate welfare. What I'm not interested in being able to do is to pay you to make your venture more profitable for you. And so, the question of altruists and having to have emergency response capability, the question of this community having to pay for emergency response equipment, is that stuff you're going to pay for? Or is that stuff that we taxpayers are going to have to pay for? And as I just heard, not only have you received subsidies, but you're also receiving tax breaks on the property that you are currently in. So you're not going to pay property taxes for a while. And so I'm very much interested in having all of you, including you, understand that we taxpayers are already supporting this project. We are already paying substantially to have you come here, and in turn we're going to have to pay more, either in the form of emergency services or when your LLC goes bankrupt as a result of the spill. And so this is indeed something that is in the limelight now. And I am interested, as a liberal, with some of my Tea Party conservative folks that are of the Rand Paul type, to understand that this is no different than welfare of any other kind. And I object to this happening because it's not a level playing field. And this is entirely for the Department of Defense to do something that is truly untested and not viable, which is why they're giving you money.
Well, I appreciate your comment. I think what I can say is that the Defense Production Act has existed since the end of World War II. That's, going on 70 years or so. That exists for the Department of Defense to encourage and maintain industries and businesses that they feel are vital to the nation's strategic defense. That's what that act is set up for. And they do some really interesting stuff. If they think that they need precision ball bearings that nobody else in the world is going to need, they will help maintain that. They do some interesting stuff with materials and other things. Now, when it comes to renewable fuels, they felt like encouraging an alternative source of fuel supply domestically was really important. When you talk to the Navy, and you can hear them, they're out in the public talking about this. If the price of crude oil goes up $1, that's $30 million less that the Navy has to train and equip our soldiers. Now, I'm not going to talk about stance on war or conservative or liberal politics, but I will say that what the Navy and Department of Energy and Department of Ag have done through the Defense Production Act is partner with private companies like us. And yes, they are funded by the taxpayers, absolutely. Those funds, through the Defense Production Act, get married to private funds. The agencies could not pull off the projects themselves. They don't have the sufficient resources to do it. Those are strategic directions that those agencies want to take, and they seek out private partners like us to do it. We applied in a competitive process to win that. So I wanted to address that element of the question. And the second is, that for a long time now, I've been working with leaders in the town and the county to sort out the relationship between Red Rock and the town and the county. And I think we're doing a great job. And I think we will be a very valuable community member, and you'll see us pull our own weight. So with that, sir.
Isn't a good percentage of your funding take private equity funding?
Absolutely.
This isn't all government money.
No, it's not. So the two public numbers are out there. It's a $70 million technical investment agreement from those agencies, and it's a $200 million plant to build. And that's just the plant. There are other costs too. So some pretty easy math says that they're only about 30% of the funding to build the plant, and all of the rest is coming from private capital. So another way to look at it is the taxpayers are getting a pretty good deal for their money.
Jeff, could you mention for the audience the other two plants that are similar to yours in other communities that have become viable just like ours? I'm especially interested in that fact because taxpayer money is taxpayer money, whether it's Lakeview residents paying their federal taxes or Reno residents paying their taxes. That then it gets spread out to whoever's successful in having projects like this come to fruition.
Yes, thank you. So there were two other recipients of this technical investment agreement funding. One is called Fulcrum, and they are building a somewhat similar facility down in the Reno area. They are using what's called RDF. It's a derivative of trash. You take trash, you separate out a number of the recyclables. The bits that you're left over with is called RDF. And they're feeding that through gasification, Fischer-Tropsch, and product upgrading. They're using slightly different technologies compared to what we're doing, but it's by and large the same thing. And that's another couple $100 million plant that Fulcrum is planning on building. The other recipient is called Red Rock Biofuels, and they are planning on constructing a much larger facility with a very different process down in Louisiana, where they're going to upgrade waste, fats, greases, and oils. And the projects are very dissimilar in terms of the cost of feedstock and the process and everything else, but there'll be a facility down in Louisiana, I think that will benefit from that facilities and location. Does that answer your question? Right? Sir?
Will you be operating 24/7?
Yes, so the plant will operate 24/7. It will not run 365 days a year because we'll be down for scheduled maintenance and occasional outages. But our operational plan is about 340 days a year. Sir?
Two-part question. First one will be to Paul. Is there or has there been or will there be issued a hazmat certificate for the rail from there to the location where it hooks up with the other rail? And what is the capacity during, say, snow, ice, or any other natural disaster that might occur that you can store your fuel above and beyond the 1 million gallons that you mentioned earlier?
So I might like Paul just address the material safety and the data sheets. I will say at the front of that, all of the fuels that we produce meet what's called an ASTM spec. These are all fuels that are being produced in refineries today. The fuel that comes out of ours, apart from the fact that it started from biomass, is no different than the fuel that started through a Fischer-Tropsch refinery that started with coal. At the end of the day, you have the same fuel. Ours just started with a renewable resource. So they have long history of commercial use. We will have, as we do at our other renewable fuels facilities, material safety data sheets on all the materials inside the plant, including our products. And I strongly suspect that Paul and his railroad have various procedures for all of the different materials that they haul. But let Paul address that.
So in terms of certification of the railroad, it's very basic. There's about 300 small rail carriers around the United States that are hauling tank cars of various stuff, a lot of which would worry me more as a business owner. Ammonia, chlorine. I mean, this is petrol. It's the same stuff you have on your highways. So it's essentially, we're already there. We don't haul hazmat on this railroad. There's not presently a market for us to say, bring diesel or residual oil. We've looked at some of those things in the past. It presently makes sense to truck those. If there's a refinery here, we'll probably be hauling tank cars of petrol to the Bay Area. As far as the weather or downtime history of our railroad, we really haven't had any significant downtime in the 6 years that I've been here. We inspect our track on a regular basis. We repair our track on a regular basis. Same thing with the bridges. Downtime is, and you can talk to Cornerstone and Collins. There's an occasional frustration with repairs and situations that we run into, but downtime has not been a situation that has caused any hardship to those customers.
Paul, on an average, how many rail cars per year versus the 500 that was mentioned additional actually go over the rail?
Well, it's a little under 2,000 at this point, and that's quite a bit more than when we started. The first 6 months we were here, we moved a couple hundred, and so the railroad is really doing a lot better than it used to be that way.
I did do a visual inspection from the highway the other day, and it looks like you've been doing quite an extensive amount of work on the rail.
Yeah, and there's more to do for sure, but it's coming along. It's a 1928 infrastructure that's been added to and fixed up throughout the years, and some of it is it's a continuing project. I just came across on Highway 140 today from Klamath Falls, and I was impressed all the work that's going into that. We have different funding streams than necessarily the U.S. highways or state highways, but same kind of deal there, highways being modernized.
Okay. And one question back to you, Jeff. As far as fire safety, and I stand to be corrected if I'm not informed correctly, but the state of Oregon doesn't issue foam. Foam is the most efficient way that I know of to fight this type of fire, if there is such a case that it has to be fought, God forbid. But is there some kind of contingency your company has to supply or help supply some of the fire companies to be able to extinguish a fire or address a hazmat situation? You said you were going to train some at your plant. How far does this training extend out? Does it extend to Klamath, which your trains will be going right through my community? How far does that extend out as far as you're reaching out to different communities to make sure they're trained and have the proper equipment and application of chemicals to be able to address any situation that might arise? So we don't have something like in Charleston, West Virginia 2 weeks ago where the rail car exploded with the double wall guaranteed by the state or the government.
Yeah, we have an interest in making sure that not only our plant is safe, but the whole route that our product takes to market is safe as well. And so as we move through our construction phase, we'll be reaching out to the different fire departments along the way to make sure that those folks, that have the training, and if there's special equipment required that they don't have, that we find a way to get that into their hands. Yeah. We want to run a safe plant, and we want that product to arrive safely all the way to its final destination. Let me just say, with that, I want to just take a little break here, allow some folks, if they'd like to hop up and leave. We're right at about our 2-hour mark. I am more than happy to stay afterwards and answer questions. We can continue in a general session like this, but I just want to be respectful of people's time. And let's just take a couple-minute break and allow folks to hop up and leave if they'd like. So thank you all for being here.